Welcome to Scaling with Agility, where we explore the nuances of what does it take to scale your organization without the dogma and the theater and achieve real outcomes. I'm Yuval Yeret, and with me today is my friend Jesper Boeg. Jesper and I know each other from way back in the Lean Kanban conferences day. Today, Jesper and I wanted to talk about what does it take to achieve meaningful product business agility change in your organization. You might want to call it transformation. How do you achieve the outcomes that business agility promises? What does it look like? What have we seen work? What have we seen not work? Jesper, for those in the audience that are not familiar with you, what brings you here?
Yes, I think you only come from similar backgrounds. I've been working with transformations for the past almost 20 years, I think, now. And maybe in a similar path, we're following this as it came from like a team level agenda to becoming a department level agenda to becoming a business unit level organizational, and then moving into all the aspects of finance, leadership, organizational structures, etc. Kind of my career has moved as this has transcended like the typical a couple of teams level to becoming more of an organizational focus, and now to the extent where I think very few organizations are not aware of this, even if fewer that we would like are able to succeed with many of the principles that we'll be discussing today, I guess.
What have you seen change? More organizations are aware of agility, but what else have you seen change in the landscape around us? What we have to face as agilists, what leaders that are trying to apply this in their organization have to face? What choices are they struggling with? What choices are they making differently than they were making in the past?
So at least for me personally, I think looking at this from the business side of the equation seems to be an agenda that's becoming more and more apparent, and also moving into the CXO layers of the organization. If you cannot stay ahead of the curve, then you cannot keep up. It might be 2, 3, 5, 10 years before you're out of business. But if you see the whole world around you moving faster, being more adaptive, being more dynamic, then at the end of the day, it is a CXO problem because it's your entire strategy that's suddenly at risk. So I think that's definitely moving up. And then I think we could also probably discuss many of the more depressing facts in terms of what has not changed in terms of trying to get there. But we have obviously a bit of time today to get into both what is working, what is moving in the positive direction, and where do we see maybe more organizations stalling than we would have hoped to see in 2024.
Maybe let's start with defining what does it. So business agility is a cool term. What does it mean? Does it mean you use daily scrums for your sales team? Does it mean you run sprints for your talent acquisition? What's your perspective on, and I'll share mine, but I'm curious, how do you see the
So I
role?
think
What does it mean
from
to-
my perspective, when we use the word business agility, it has nothing to do with the elements that you just mentioned. And personally, like for years, I haven't cared whether a team or a group of people or whatever would use one way of approaching this or another. But I think it's a lot to do with how you face the market around you. So at least if I were to define it, I usually do it through 3 elements. First, if you're not seeing shorter lead times, then it becomes very, very difficult to iterate towards your market. So one way or the other, you have to bring lead time down on your actual delivery. So that's the output element. So if your output deliveries are not short enough, it becomes very difficult to impact the market on a continuous basis. And then there's the element of finding out what is then the right thing to impact the world with. Because if you're just fast, but you keep getting it wrong all the time, then there's literally very little sense in driving faster feedback loops. So there's also this element of discovery and feedback where I think in 2006, agile was all about just trying to create a minimum viable something and get it out there. I think the attention has now moved to more of the product discovery aspects to see, can we learn quicker about our market space so that the shorter lead times of our output start to make a lot more sense. Then there's a third element to me that's the more strategic way where you can do the first 2, But if you're not able to explore the changes in your market space and actually inspect and adapt on the more tactical and strategic level, then you're not truly business agile because you're not able to move into new market spaces or move with your products. Yes, I think you only come from similar backgrounds. I've been working with transformations for the past almost 20 years, I think, now. And maybe in a similar path, we're following this as it came from like a team level agenda to becoming a department level agenda to becoming a business unit level organizational, and then moving into all the aspects of finance, leadership, organizational structures, etc. So kind of my career has moved as this has transcended like the typical a couple of teams level to becoming more of an organizational focus, and now to the extent where I think very few organizations are not aware of this, even if fewer that we would like are able to succeed with many of the principles that we'll be discussing today.
What have you seen change? Like more organizations are aware of agility, but what else have you seen change in the landscape around us? What leaders that are trying to apply this in their organization have to face? What choices are they struggling with? What choices are they making differently than they were making in the past?
So at least for me personally, I think that's a good thing. I think looking at this from the business side of the equation seems to be an agenda that's becoming more apparent, and also moving into the CXO layers of the organization. If you cannot stay ahead of the curve, then you cannot keep up. And it might be 2, 3, 5, 10 years before you're out of business. But if you see the whole world around you moving faster, being more adaptive, being more dynamic, then at the end of the day, it is a CXO problem because it's your entire strategy that's suddenly at risk. So I think that's definitely moving up. And then I think we could also probably discuss many of the more depressing facts in terms of what has not changed in trying to get there. We have obviously a bit of time today to get into both what is working, what is moving in positive direction, and what you see maybe more organizations stalling than we would have hoped to see in 2024.
Maybe let's start with defining what does it. So business agility is a cool term. What does it mean? Does it mean you use daily scrums for your sales team? Does it mean you run sprints for your talent acquisition? What's your perspective on, and I'll share mine, but I'm curious, how do you see the
perspective? When we use the word business agility, it has nothing to do with the elements that you just mentioned. And personally, like for years, I haven't cared whether a team or a group of people or whatever would use one way of approaching this or another. But I think it's a lot to do with how you face the market around you. So at least if I were to define it, I usually do it through 3 elements. First, if you're not seeing shorter lead times, then it becomes very, very difficult to iterate towards your market. So one way or the other, you have to bring lead time down on your actual delivery. So that's the output element. So if your output deliveries are not short enough, it becomes very difficult to impact the market on a continuous basis. And then there's the element of finding out what is then the right thing to impact the world with. Because if you're just fast, but you keep getting it wrong all the time, then there's literally very little sense in driving faster feedback loops. So there's also this element of discovery and feedback where I think in 2006, Agile was all about just trying to create a minimum viable something and get it out there. I think the attention has now moved to more of the product discovery aspects to see, can we learn quicker about our market space so that the shorter lead times of our output start to make a lot more sense. Then there's a third element to me that's the more strategic way where you can do the first 2, but if you're not able to explore the changes in your market space and actually inspect and adapt on the more tactical and strategic level, then you're not truly business agile because you're not able to move into new market spaces or move with your products or follow the competitors or staying ahead of the competitors. So that's the third element. You can essentially at the more tactical level have shorter lead times and great discovery. But if you're not moving with the market, then I think business agility would still suffer. But to me, it has nothing to do with framework-specific roles or artifacts.
lead time of what? To go back to my question, and I agree with you not about the practices, but for me, it's the question of what do you apply it to? I hear you, and I'm thinking It's a wider perspective of the same value stream that we've been talking about. So if we've been talking about working software, what we're talking about is it's not just working, it's gone to market, it's in the hands of our customers, and then we can use that feedback loop to improve our products. That's one way to see business agility. I guess when I look at it, my definition goes beyond that and says, okay, our products is one thing we need to be more agile on. But in order to be successful as a business, there are other things we might need to be more adaptive on. So, for example, I had this client where what they're doing is they're moving, a lot of people are doing this, is private equity and growth playbook of the day until everybody does this, from licensing to subscriptions, from perpetual licenses to a subscription model. That does not necessarily change your product. I mean, it does change your product in some ways, but there are other changes to how you sell, how you run your finances, how you run customer success. Churn becomes a thing like Salesforce discovered some years ago. Making a change from a business that is focused on perpetual sales to a business that is focused on subscriptions and ARR, organizations have some time to go through that change. But, the later you're into this wall, the faster you need to go through this change to make it. If you want to go into product-led growth, that's another type of change. If you want to adopt AI to improve your operations, that's another change. For me, being agile or business agility for me means you run an agile operating system for your business, not just for your product value stream, but also for other things. If you're thinking about this from a lean perspective and you apply lead times and value streams, you do this for everything. And it's tempting. And I've seen people, come in and say, just do it for everything. Like, run this sort of operating system for your sales and for the day-to-day marketing, your postings on LinkedIn. And it's tempting to go into Monday or ClickUp or Trello or whatever way you manage the work and just manage people using those techniques. And there are some interesting things that happen when you do. Have you seen organizations try to apply agile to areas where it does, or agile thinking, or even those flow metrics or flow principles that you're talking about, the wrong way, in the wrong places?
And I think that's really, there are many elements to the thing to bring up here, very interesting ones, because I think what you talk about here is the third principle I mentioned, being able to move or stay ahead of the markets. If you want to move into a subscription model because you think there's going to be a strategic shift there, then your ability to adapt quickly towards that new strategic direction, that's to me part of that more strategic or tactical business agility that we want to see. Because if you're just doing the first two, and you're just staying with your old products, and all your competitors are moving towards a different model because it's simply just more successful. Then if you cannot make those moves, then you can do all the great product discovery processes you want, and you can have shorter lead times, but you're still going to be out of business because you're simply not moving with the market or staying ahead of it. And then I think your other question here is I think we've both seen that in many cases. So the typical one being back in the days when agile was put on everything, then of course your CXO leadership group or team, they had to do so-called agile as well. So they would suddenly be doing stand-ups in the morning, and they would have a Jira type like board or whatever, and would be looked at exactly the way you would look at a product team developing software. And I think we've probably both seen that with a very limited lifespan, because it was not a very great fit to their type of work, and it was kind of trying to fit a round peg through a square hole, or the opposite, right?
So I had an interesting experience around that. I think it relates to the pattern that I've seen of what works and what doesn't work as well. I've worked with the CXO team. They don't call themselves the CXO team. It was a scale-up biotech. It was the leadership, but C-level people. And they were real believers in agility, and they wanted to start to use agile techniques to help them run the company, help them focus on the right things, help them manage the flow of big things, big initiatives that they needed to tackle and not take on too much. And what we found useful there is to use agility practices and principles for the work on the company, for the work of developing the company. Initiatives like we want to think about how to restructure. We want to think about how do we onboard people much faster and more effectively than we are right now. How do we become more attractive to our partners? Different initiatives that they were working on. What didn't work well and, steered them very quickly away from that is using that to manage all of the work of each one of C-suite members. The CFO doesn't need this team to manage their work. And I think that's, by the way, a pattern that agile teams need to learn as well. There's a limit to what you need to manage at a team level, even at the level of the developers or the product team. What's important is to manage the interactions, manage the collaboration between these. So a pattern that I extract to the world of business agility is about all of the work of developing your company, seeing your company as a product and then applying product techniques. You don't need it for the day-to-day. Similar to OKRs, one of the anti-patterns that I'm seeing is everything comes in OKR. You get an OKR. All of your things are OKRs. Everything that runs in the organization is an OKR. You don't really need that. Focus OKRs on developing, working on the business rather than in business if you want. The EME thing.
Yeah, and I also think it's a matter of looking at the world as it really is. So I think, at least I've seen a number of times where you've had consultants in and they set up like tons and tons and tons of structures. And the whole element was to try to simplify, but it's not simple in any way. It's actually gotten rather complicated. And then you kind of close your eyes to the fact that after 6 months, very little of that structure is now used in the way that it was assumed it would be, or maybe not at all. And then getting a bit realistic, as you said, and said, do these principles make sense all over the place? Or did somebody give us a hammer and now we were just trying to hammer on every single thing we could find that would just remotely fit where we thought this could be used? And I think the CXO team is just one of many examples of let's try to get it back to what we're really trying to do instead of how many places can we apply some techniques that might have been originating from a very different context.
Let's think about Chris, the CEO of a company. They are interested in business agility. They're feeling like their company does need to make strategic moves faster, be more effective with the strategic opportunities, make bets, be able to try more bets, faster turnaround time for these bets, whether those are product bets or nothing to do with product. What would we suggest to Chris or Chris's COO, Olivia? What should they take? Where should they be careful? What are some warning signs when they talk to somebody about doing this?
And I think, to me at least, and I've been part of that myself, so I'm in no way innocent, but I think 15 years ago, I also just started in the wrong place, to be honest. So often just having that conversation about where do you want to go? So what's your strategy? And if your strategy is to be customer centric, probably we need to talk about a different kind of strategy that's not generic across 99% of all companies, because then it's really not a strategy. And if you're not able to tell me that quite clearly, then probably you're not able to communicate that direction to the organization. Then it becomes very difficult for both your leadership teams and your development teams to actually follow where we want to go, because we haven't really communicated where we want to go and why. And then again, if that's reasonably clear, then let's move on to talking about how does that match how you're set up as a company. And I've had this saying for like 10 plus years, show me the way you're organized, then I'll tell you your strategy. And then somebody puts, no, we have a strategy slide, they go over here and that's our strategy. No, just tell me how you're organized and I will tell you how you're truly, or
So
what direction you're
Conway's law
truly.
applied to the organizational level, not
Yeah.
just.
And it's almost always true. So you might have a strategy saying we want to move from custom services to more standard products. And then you see people organized around single customers. And I can tell you with 99% surety that you're going to get custom services because you're organized in a way that will only drive that type of license. Kind of applying a different strategy on top of that structure, it's almost impossible because every single day you need to force it in a way that the organization is simply not designed to move in. So let's have that conversation about how you're organized and how your business unit missions or your team level missions, how that match your overall strategy. And again, if that's reasonably clear, then let's talk about funding. And if I see you trying to get out of one market space and into another, but you're still investing more funding, which almost always equals capacity in the old market space, again, I will challenge you whether you're able to make that shift if your funding is not matching how you're actually set up. I think that's really what it comes down to. Before we get to using boards at a C level or how teams work with Scrum or whatever other things they prefer, there are so many much more important discussions we need to have because they are even remotely relevant.
So let me challenge you on that for a second.
Yeah.
One of the powers of starting with a Kanban board at the right level for the right things and not everything is it's lightweight. It's a lightweight intervention. And in a recent client that I'm working with, we were debating whether to wait until we establish what's the strategy or get the right people into the room to even think about, are we strategic versus not? And it was much easier to show them a mirror very quickly of this is what we're actually investing. So showing the actual funding for things, showing where the capacity is really going, showing that there are no choices, there are no trade-offs. We're doing everything from everything. We're just dumping the new business line right on top of the other. One of the things that I've seen is how Kanban boards at the business level, that you might call the business portfolio, whatever the name, even just mapping what are your goals right now, how they are, not spending months on are they outcome oriented or not, although that's a fascinating exercise. Whatever they are, mapping those and providing a mirror starts to drive towards the conversation that you're describing. So I've seen how this nudge, what I've learned over the years is to find these nudges, these small pushes, like you do that and it opens the door for a bigger thing. Sometimes they don't work, but sometimes, an innocent question when the leadership team talks about strategic things, like, do those things actually help us make trade-offs? It's frightening to ask that question depending on the forum, but it can be magical from what I've seen. So I guess we'll both agree that it's not one size fits all and there are different patterns that you can try and introduce. But I think the meta pattern that I'm hearing is don't go in and try to find nails in the organization with your hammer. Go in light, try to sense, try to use nudges, try to push in the right areas, try to find the constraints, I guess. Where are the problems? What is this business trying to do? Chris Metz talks about feature injection. Pull from the problems of your customers. What is the problem? And then let's pull from that and see if they really need it.
And I think we're all biased by our experiences. So I think I'm biased by the fact that I've seen very few others, including myself, succeed with driving these things mainly bottom up. There's simply a glass ceiling that's incredibly difficult, if not impossible to penetrate. And then how you get those nudges in, I think there are a couple of important questions. And it's perfectly fair. If you're in there to help out a single team and you want them to just get to a better place, that's a perfectly fair order of business. And you should just focus on that. That's just not the business I'm in. I'm in the business of trying to help organizations.
No,
However, you find those nudges. I think there are some key things like, are you talking to people that can really help this organization move? And if you're talking to a single department lead and you're trying to move an organization, that's just going to be a very, very difficult exercise. So first of all, are you talking to the right people in terms of just framing the whole exercise? And then my nudge is typically just to get that permission to do somewhere between 15 and 40 interviews across the organization, and hopefully also including some customers, especially if it's a B2B context, to get that kind of current state. And so this is what your own organization is telling you, guys. You've just given me some documentation in terms of your strategy, in terms of your key numbers, in terms of employee customer satisfaction. And then I have these interviews that I just pulled some notes from. And this is just what the world is telling you. And then from there, you have a conversation about where do you then want to move? What type of company do you want to be? That is typically very easy to talk about the gap between your current state and the type of company that you're trying to become. And that is my nudge to starting that conversation about, okay, so how do we move from one to the other? And if you're dealing with more than, let's say, 150 people, it's very difficult to make that step. It's typically much more effective to find a vertical slice of the organization where let's start in a single business unit and let's get them up and running and face the fact that it's not going to be because you still have some interfaces to the other part of the company that's running on a different operating model for a period of time. But let's prove success in a vertical slice, move from here.
yeah. So let's go back to Chris. Chris, the CEO, he wants to do something. We have a good starting point, right? Because it's Chris and Olivia, the COO, they are the right people to do this. So with that as the starting point, we do have some options. One option is to get into a room and discuss what's the strategy. Not try to necessarily formulate new strategy, but ask them to reflect what is their current strategy. I think what I heard you say is compare that to how they're structured, how they're funded, what are they working on. Could be an interesting realization when you look at these two things on two sides of the room or next to each other on a big virtual screen, and then have some conversations about what are some options, what could we do to help us align a bit more with our strategy. And the other thing they could do is they could start thinking about, okay, how can we be more focused? How can we start to manage this relationship between strategy and execution on a day-to-day basis without going and changing the operating model in the entire company? What does that look like? Maybe it is to start to use some more flow-oriented, outcome-oriented view of the biggest things that they want to do or are working on, at least on paper, for developing the company. Not the operational day-to-day, but those biggest initiatives. And then to go to the vertical slice notion, maybe as part of that exercise, and maybe over time, they see there's this thing that we really struggle with. And it might be building a new product. It might be doing things across products. It might be a go-to-market technique. We're trying to move from spin selling to value-oriented selling or relationship selling or to apply a PLG motion, whatever it is. If they're saying this is our real challenge or AI transformation, you can't go anywhere these days without AI transformation being a thing that they're trying. And at that point, Chris and Olivia and the team might say, okay, if we believe in this thing where we want to be focused, we want to be strategic, we believe in customer centricity and apply to whatever we do, not broadly, but if there's this thing, AI transformation, let's take that. What does it mean to be customer centric in AI transformation? If it's AI transformation for the product, it's one thing. But if it's an internal focused AI transformation, customers are our employees. So what does it look like to apply product thinking there? So the vertical slice might be, okay, that's the development value stream that's working on leveraging AI implementation. Let's apply this new thinking there. Not everywhere. Other things in the organization might continue as they are. We might have just this thinking at the top level and also a very deep slice through this specific initiative that is one of our biggest, more strategic, more risky bets. And that's one of the other things that I found work really well is to put in front of leadership some sort of metrics of where's the biggest potential for being adaptive, for being agile, and showing them you don't have to do this for everything. If you have sure bets, if you have operational work, don't bother. If you have things where there's a lot of risk, whether it's will people inside the organization want to use AI, or will they actually feel like it's compressing labor and showing them the door? Eli Goldratt talked about don't, ask people to cut the branch that they're sitting on. And, AI transformation is the latest in a long sequence of things that do that. How do we get people to actually use AI and thrive without sabotaging this experience, or at least an Italian strike? The concern might be it's too expensive, right? The concern might be we can't even do that. That might be the life that you choose to apply, and it might have nothing to do with your real product. You might not even be a product company. You might be a hotel and hospitality.
Yeah. And I think there are many interesting elements in this conversation. One of them being that if you can find a true vertical slice, then it is hopefully impacting the real world problems from day one. So if the problem is that you've done one successful horizontal slice where we literally took out the whole platform area and started looking at that from a product perspective, and literally talking about the internal customers as a free market and us wanting to optimize on the engagement, standardization, not from a point of enforcement, but trying to get people to choose the standard products because they're just more successful and more easy to use and will actually lower the cognitive load of all the stuff you're trying to do in the more streamlined part of the organization. But getting that vertical slice will also get you permission to do stuff that you couldn't do if you're doing a big bang transformation. Anything from how you fund and finance stuff. So if you come and say, okay, I'm going to change your entire financial model for how you operate across the entire company, that's a difficult thing to get permission to do from day one. But if you say, we're only going to get this freedom to do things differently for these 150 people in this business unit, then it's much, much easier to get permission to test these things off. The same in terms of structures. We're going to organize ourselves in a different way. We're going to have different leadership responsibilities. We're going to be much more market focused. It's difficult. And you're also risking dealing with all those things that will go wrong because there are always things that are not going as planned. So just the noise and the frustration and trying to deal with that across 2,000 people is a way more difficult exercise than if you've contained that within 150 people, which is a much more realistic exercise if you want to create success early on. So I think there are many elements to if you can somehow address organizational transformation from a more iterative perspective. The challenge being then, I think we need to be very, very aware. If you're truly under a great deal of pressure on your key number, then there's going to be a very, very large temptation to go faster than your change capacity truly is. And you see one thing and you want to apply it everywhere. And you don't realize how much you will slow things down by suddenly needing to, because then you're no longer talking about experimenting. You're no longer talking about trying things out. You're suddenly implementing a new operating model at once in the first go across the company. So I think
I was hoping you'll go there because this is a pattern, a failure pattern that I've seen way too often. It's successful. Let's celebrate and then copy paste. And every time I've seen it happen, it's followed by mandates. It's followed by telling people or working. If you think about crossing the chasm, it's initial group, vertical slice. It's typically, if you choose right, early adopters. I mean, if you're trying to do the first vertical slice with the laggards, the skeptics, good luck with it. You won't even succeed the first time. But let's say you chose the right people. They were willing to do this, meaning they were early adopters. Now it's successful. There might be some others that want to fast follow and they still want to do this, but if you're doing it all across the board at once, you don't have the capacity for it. The law of the raspberry jam, Jerry Weinberg's law applies, and, you won't have the expertise to support this. What you're saying is, okay, I don't need that expertise because it's not, like you're saying, it's not an experiment anymore. We have the playbook. This is the playbook. Go implement the playbook. So you've taken something, you're telling people how to do it, and those people are now, a lot of them are skeptics. They're laggards. They're the people that want things to be fully proven, but even they want to be involved in how they do things. They don't have time. They don't have energy. That it's not their priority to tackle this change. So on one hand, you can probably see how vivid this is in my head. On one hand, they don't want to be changed. They don't want to be told what to do. On the other end, they don't have time to be involved in co-creating the change. And that creates this sort of perfect storm. If you look at what's going on in the industry around us and how often people talk about this framework doesn't work, that framework doesn't work, I have the hypothesis, based at least on anecdotal data from my engagements and the organizations I've seen, that a lot of the time it's those later stages of the crossing the chasm, even within organizations, but also in the wider market, that are causing this frustration, that are causing this situation where the framework isn't working. People don't like that the framework isn't working. They're saying, it's broken. The people that are the experts are saying, you're not doing it right. It's like this argument around this steak is medium rare, this steak is medium. It's like we're shooting ourselves in the foot when we're managing transformation this way, whether it's a safe transformation, business agility, Kanban, Scrum, whatever. The only situations I've seen work is where leaders actually refuse to say, this is how we're doing things. They were willing to be patient. That's so rare.
And I think it's been a long time since I've been in there implementing a framework, no matter it being a scale framework like SAFe or a more team level like Scrum or whatever. It's been a very long time. So I think the way I've gone about it in the last 10 plus years has been different. We've separated the core principles from the implementation. And that's made some of these exercises easier. Every time we enter something from career development in the company, or how you work as a team with certain discovery or delivery practices, or the roles or whatever, a lot of that becomes less of a framework and more of a starter kit. So as long as you're staying true to these core principles that we've defined early on, then there are no way of frameworks that you cannot use. There are things in place so that if we truly believe in more modern practices, then we're going to need some principles so that you don't go back to, okay, so let's stay hidden for 12 months and then go stealth. And now after 12 months, we'll enter the market, big bang, and think suddenly we caused something major and be vastly disappointed in most of those cases. So there needs to be principles in place to stay true to like the core things we're trying to achieve, but whether you do things in one way or another. And even you can then have one business unit falling in love with a specific framework, and just from the passion of falling in love with that framework, they will probably make that work. But then another business unit, they can choose a different, either a starter kit, or they can later adopt that starter kit to their framework.
But where's the consistency, Jesper? You're creating a nightmare of consistency for the transformation office.
Yeah, but that's the thing. I'm not in business to supply usable solutions for the transformation office. I would much rather have organizations where the people that are doing the actual work are passionate, both of their products and their way of working. I think it's just important to realize that comes from your personal preferences, your background, and your history. And I have found people that could make Scrum work in situations where theoretically that should be impossible because it's just such a bad fit. But just from the passion of the work, they've gotten real value out of it. And in other situations, you could have a perfect fit for a specific way of working. and it would never, ever work because people would be against it from the very beginning. And that kind of personal preference, that drive to make things work, I think that's much more important than trying to standardize those mechanics.
I'm the last person to argue against focusing on principles first and being very careful with what framework you use or you want to use. I think there's an interesting conversation on what does consistency look like. I think principles are a good start, but the next level, and I was just having a conversation last night about this with the product leader who's trying to evolve their organization to be more product oriented without making huge changes, without telling the teams what to do. We aligned pretty easily on the principles, but the next level would be, okay, so what's the interface? We're both developers way back. What's the interface? What's the API the teams do provide? I don't care what they do inside, but maybe the API is they believe in principles. Maybe it's they follow principles. There's a certain set of things, even over other things that they follow, whatever's that's for your organization. There should be clear trade-offs. There should be some things that they're willing not to do, but maybe there's also a set of metrics, leading indicators. Like you talked about lead time. I struggle to find an example of a development value stream. People doing complex work that benefits from iteration and adaptation, build, measure, learn, sense, respond. I struggle to find an example where focusing on lead time, flow time, cycle time through the loop is not important. So I don't care how you do the work, but you measure that, provide transparency to what is your time through the loop, what is your time to deliver a slice of product, the time to deliver a slice of your AI context that people can now start to use, a slice of a new approach to how you post the job descriptions on Workday, or, what kind of questions you ask candidates that don't get them mad and that the great people would want to come for you based on their Workday experience rather than hate your guts even before the first talent acquisition interview. How quickly do you close that loop? How many things do you have in the pipeline that you work on? Those kind of flow metrics I find are useful ways to bring to life principles. And there's probably a set of other indicators for the other principles that we believe in, like empowerment and organizing around outcomes, that, still working on what's that set of metrics and indicators that are important regardless of how you actually move the needle on.
That's a very interesting conversation. I think I've been through quite a journey myself. So 10 years ago, I would focus quite a lot on also being able to measure these changes. And I think right now, I'm really much more concerned with people understanding the why behind these principles. So I'm looking much more, how much are these even like really discussing with the CXO, or you're discussing with a product manager, or you're discussing with an engineer? How much are they talking about the need to drive lead time on their experiments down? How much are they focusing on separating delivery from discovery? Yeah, I know, but it's much more of an observable thing rather than a measurable thing. So it's much more, what type of conversations are we having, and are we observing those types of conversations? Because then alone, like, let's just take lead time. It's a very difficult thing to measure consistently, because when do you start tracking? If you look more to the DevOps side of it, they'll start tracking from the point where all the fluffy front end is already gone, and now they just need to push it out. And that's a great thing, because that means you can really, at the very last part of your delivery pipeline, that can really speed things up. But if the whole
doors down,
your front end is very, very slow, and you spend 6 months discovering what you should put in production, it's a very, very small fraction of your total lead time. And maybe then it's not interesting to look only at that point, right? So I think understanding the key principle and why these things are important, those are really crucial if you want these things to continue beyond the honeymoon transformation period, where everybody is involved.
I think in this case, it's both, you know, the why, you understand the intent so that you can find the right way to implement it, to follow it, to think through it. And it's also useful to have something tangible that people latch onto without being too prescriptive. And I find that talking about outcomes or leading indicators that Josh Seiden and Jeff Gothel, you know, taught me who does what by how much. Talking about changes to your operating model in that language, I think is a useful distinction. And that captures both what you're talking about, which is great. Like, you know, a VP R&D, I want to see a behavior where the R&D leaders talk about stop starting, start finishing, or ask questions around should we really start something and being careful with starting new things X times a week. I want to see them talking more about that than pushing new things to the pipeline. You know, is that measurable? There are ways to measure it. You could observe sporadically. You could use AI to record the meetings and do sentiment analysis and probably not a bad idea to go into your conversations and do sentiment analysis of is it a push conversation versus a pull conversation. And right now, maybe it's 90% of the time a push conversation. Can we do this one more thing? Maybe we can get it to be 50-50. Maybe we can get it over time to something else. For me, it's a great metric, even though it's not coming from Jira or whatever.
Yeah, and I think, again, we're probably all biased from our historic successes and failures. And I think in my own failures with to measure too much and have data on too much, maybe AI is actually going to be a game changer, something that I've now put in the let's try to make it observable rather than measurable. Maybe that can actually now become measurable again without distracting our focus from what is really the important thing going on. But at least I've definitely been through a 10-year period where I've moved a lot of what I would have tried to place in the measurable bucket, which I'm now satisfied having in the observable bucket.
Philosophical
with AI
conversation. I think we have different definitions of measurable. Like if you look at New Relic, for example, that's an observability platform. They would probably tell you that lets you measure a lot of the things that they observe.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about is things that are harder to measure, right? That you can measure based on observation. You cannot measure with hard data in a system, in a work management system, in an LM. There's even a worse pattern that I think you're hinting at that I've seen quite a bit. When it's hard, we often have options. We could choose something that is observable, measurable in a soft manner, not a hard measure, which would be more indicative of are people thinking about the principles? Are we creating the right outcomes?
Storytelling at the end
hard
of the
to
day.
measure. It's not accurate. We have hard measure. You could extract it from your Jira or whatever. And a lot of people, especially when you come from engineering, especially when you come from project management, even when you come from the CFO, from the finance world, you want the hard measures. And you choose the hard measures that a lot of the time are vanity metrics or worse.
Yeah, and you sometimes end up investing.
They might not be useful. They might be much from the outcomes, or they might be creating a cycle of enshittification of outcomes. And I think you nailed something there, which is focus on the right indicators, not how easy it is to measure them and not how accurate.
And I think there's a problem in terms of how, at least I've failed myself in that area too, where you don't consider what is the cost and what type of behavior does it drive and how much will this shift attention from the why behind it towards the metric or the observability. And definitely, like I think back in the early 2000s, at least I was definitely in there trying to find out how much time people would spend in a planning meeting and talking about them, well, that's probably too much. And at the end of the day, maybe we should have started the conversation about why you were even in this room. Because looking back at a lot of the people there, they didn't even agree on the purpose of being there. For some, it was at one end of the scale, it was about stacking up a number of story points until it made like sense in terms of a certain limit they should stay within, and being very, very precise in terms of whether they could execute that scope within the time period available to them. And in other cases, it was at the very other end of the spectrum where it was literally just about having a direction for a not specific time frame. And probably just talking about, okay, what are we in here for? Are we in here to make sure that there's a reasonable amount of flow on whatever we start? That's probably a healthy conversation to have. What does flow mean? What is the difference between having to start and stop because we have to put things aside for 2 days while we cannot work on it, and the start-stopping nature of that work, and how that's not a very pleasant way and effective way of working? How much does this translate into a focus so we're not spreading our efforts all across the board and not really achieving any business results? But if we agree that maybe if those two things are key in terms of why we find ourselves in this room, maybe that's a conversation we need to have before we start talking about whether we need to stack story points or whether we can have a bit of a looser approach to that conversation. So I think now we're really down in the operational details, mimicking the same behavior we sometimes see at the CXO level. Yeah, we want a product organization, but did you talk about the why behind that product organization and how that translates into business impact and how much actual responsibility that places on you guys in terms of defining both the funding and the missions that you would like to see come out of this type of product organization? Because just labeling a product organization, yes, I've seen companies literally having what they entitled product organization around 100 technical solutions, where had you gone to a customer, none of them would have recognized any of that as products, but it was definitely products from a technical perspective. And obviously that drove a huge amount of cross-organizational coordination, and a single team owning a product could deliver, like they had 0% of delivering business value on their own, but they were still defined as they were fully product organized across the board.
So going back to Chris and Olivia, I guess what we're saying here, maybe as closing thoughts, is one of the first things it might be interesting for them to explore is, what do they currently consider as products, external facing and internal facing? What should the products be? Which of these products are like context? Like everybody has a workday these days. I don't know in Europe, but in the US, everybody has workday. Do we really want to compete based on our hiring and talent acquisition process? Maybe we do. And if so, customizing, improving that experience is important. If we don't, if that's not an area we want to be special in, maybe it's a product we use as close to off the shelf as possible, and we don't do much about it. With our externally facing products, we need to have a conversation about what's the core, what's the context, where do we want to invest, how is that aligned to our strategy, what does that say about our strategy, where's the mapping, and start from there.
Exactly. So, and I think you've got some very good points there, because if you don't start the conversation around who are you actually servicing, and is that important to you, and can we create a structure around that where 8 out of 10 times you can actually impact that value without having to coordinate with 6 other business units or teams around you, then you're already starting this from a good place, because that will naturally drive a dialogue around product segmentation that I find a lot of companies, they just skip that. They looked at Spotify or something else, say, okay, we're just going to copy their way of segmenting their product. And maybe you should have driven it by a very different way. For them, it might be a customer journey touch point, and for you, it might be a user segmentation. But if you're not even having that dialogue around the trade-offs, then it becomes just let's mechanically structure our companies around something that we saw somewhere else. And I don't think that's a good way to go about it.
Yeah. All right. we've given Chris and Olivia a lot to think about. If people want to learn more, follow what you're doing, what you're up to, Jesper, where should they go? What should they do?
Yeah, as some might know, I've been independent for the past 10 years, but this February I joined a company called Enterprise Movement, where we're just setting that up to try to be able to do a lot of stuff we've tried to discuss today at a bigger scale. So Enterprise Movement is now my new home, but then obviously I still got my LinkedIn profile, etc. But communicating from a bit of a broader context now and not just the first one-man show.
Sounds good. Bring its advantages and challenges always.
Of course.
Right.
Now you need to take your own medicine, and that's actually it's so easy to talk about other companies' strategy and their missions and their products and whatever. And now you suddenly have to do that. And you cannot set yourself aside from that conversation and analyze it from the outside.
And I know Enterprise Movement is trying to drink its own champagne and think through some of these questions around how to apply business agility to the organization. So we might have a chat about it some other time with you or others on the team. Thank you, Jesper. I hope this was useful, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of Scaling with Agility. For Jesper, I'm Yuval. See you the next time.